We are very delighted to have several panelists. In my left hand is Lisa Movius. She's the China Bureau Chief of the art newspaper, and she's based in Shanghai. In my right hand is Xiang. She's the head of exhibitions working for Power Station of Art. She's also the chief coordinator of Shanghai Biennial Office Shanghai. She's involved today mainly because she has curated the very famous show Copyleft, Appropriation Art in China in Power Station of Art. And in her right hand is Marysia Lewandowska. I hope I pronounced your name well. She's an artist. She's now joining an artist in residency program at Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, but she's based in London as well. So I'm Ling. I'm working for the Design Society based in Shenzhen, which is a collaborative project between Biennale and the China Merchants. I'm also deputy editor for Randian. So today we are going to talk about shanzhai as a very famous word, and probably most of you are very familiar with this term, but we are going to explore a little bit more about the definition of shanzhai, the context of it in China, and giving several examples of shanzhai in the art world where we used to be more familiar with it in the design and the manufacture field. And we are also going to touch base on the legality of it, what one can do to protect the copyright, and also to talk about whether this is really a Chinese thing or not. So I will invite Lisa to give a kickoff as our first speaker today.
Well, here in Hong Kong, not all of you speak Chinese or from China, so you may or may not have heard the term shanzhai before. It's one of those things where everyone knows what it means, but also no one knows what it means. If you ask 10 people what it means, you'll get 10 different definitions. Literally, it means a sort of lawless mountain village that's far removed from the rule of law and where bandits rule and you can do whatever you want. But it's come to mean a terminology of copycatting, but also improvising and adapting, especially in technology and design, but also in art and other fields. So when I've been asking people around what their definition of shanzhai is, I get the range from it's just copycatting, it's just fakes, it's just plagiarism, and there's nothing redeeming to it, to a definition that includes more hacking and creativity and appropriation, as we are going to talk about. So I think today we're going to be focusing more on the positive side of it, on the appropriation, and how China's copycat culture has resulted in a kind of new way of dialogue with originals becoming something new.
Do you want to give already some examples in the art world? So yeah.
Yes. Well, to start off and talk about the straight-up copies as well as the issues of copying of fine art, we've got some pictures here that I've taken from various fake rain rooms and sticker rooms that have been popping up in China in the last couple of years. You have, to one extreme, these places, like there was one that opened in Chengdu earlier this month that claimed to be the Random International Rain Room from London, and even used the logo and the official pictures and was marketing it as the real thing. It was not the real thing. The artists were very surprised to hear about it and very unhappy. And Use Museum, which owns the China rights to the Rain Room, tried to do an injunction to shut it down, which they took down the advertising, but they still went ahead with the fake Rain Room. And you'll see in the pictures, there's also this place in the South Bund in Shanghai. It's like 2 stories under this half-filled, newly built, full of dust mall, but it's basically an experience center for bored high school and college kids to go take selfies at and interact with technology. It's not a very good fake, but they also have added things. These recreate the sticker room with Post-its, and people just leave their little messages. And it's honestly kind of adorable. I don't think it does too much harm to the artist per se, and it allows people to enjoy themselves. And that is one interesting aspect of these things that are popping up everywhere, is that, we came in here and you see all the lines of people trying to get in and see the fair. There's, in China and in Asia, and including in Hong Kong, there's such enthusiasm for art as a experience, and yes, also as entertainment, which is its own conundrum. But the supply is still not keeping up with demand. People in Chengdu, people in Liaoning, people all over the second and third tier and even smaller places in China, they want to see the big shows, but they're not coming because China is just so big and the infrastructure is not keeping up with the enthusiasm and the demand. So on the one hand, it's ridiculous that if you look up just in Chengdu, there are about 3 or 4 different companies that advertise that they will rent you a rain room, for your party. It's unfortunate that people are making a profit off this. On the other hand, I think the audiences are actually enjoying it, and at least it's kind of a sampling until they can get the real thing.
Yeah, it becomes a kind of PR tool.
Yeah. Well, the one in Chengdu was actually a marketing stunt for a property company.
I think we are giving the microphone to Li Ping now to invite her introduce the curatorial concept and as well as maybe some philosophical link and connections in the show Copyleft, Appropriation Art in China.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. Last year, I curated an exhibition titled Copyleft, Appropriation Art in China at the Power Station of Art in Shanghai. I've paid attention to this topic for years. In 2012, I made a curatorial proposal on copy, appropriation, and shanzhai with an international artist list. When I met Boris Groys that year, Boris Groys is one curator of the Shanghai Biennale, and I sent him my proposal and discussed with him, and he said it's a great idea, but he suggested me to just focus on Chinese part because he thought just Chinese part is very meaningful and very interesting. So then finally I organized the exhibition in 3 sections. Firstly, Ling Mo. It's related to Chinese art tradition. It's very important art tradition to Ling Mo, to imitating the masterpieces. And secondly, the appropriation. It's related to the Western modern art. And thirdly, shanzhai. It's related to current social trends, especially in China. So here I appropriated Copyleft from GNU, a general public license, to represent these 3 manifestations of copying. Since copyright is not allowed to copy them, Copyleft suggests the right to copy and to creating a copy. So through the exhibition, I want to discuss some questions and some relationship and interaction between artistic production ways and new technologies and new materials. Can new technologies and new materials change the approaches to artistic production? And also the relationship between reputation and creativity and originality. Does to create a new things mean to give up the old one completely? And then also I want to discuss the relationship between intellectual property and the sharing of knowledge and inheritance of knowledge. Can we share human beings' knowledge or copyright freely and free? And from the exhibition, I also want to see the difference of appropriation art between the Western and China. I think the difference is based on the philosophy of Western and China. As we know, Plato divided the world into 2 parts. One is the apparent world. It's keeps changing. It's also the material world around us, and the other world is the unseen and unchanging world. And the former, the apparent world is a copy of the latter. So here, copy is the only thing to link the apparent world and the unseen and unchanging world. So because of this Western, this kind of Western philosophy, so the copy and the original is in a dual opposition in Western philosophy. But in China, the situation is very different. For example, in the I Ching, yin and yang can change and turn into each other. So the original and the copy are not oppositional. Even the most precious masterpieces, people could add writings and stemples like we do today on the social media, like we praising and commenting or forwarding posts to each other. But on the Western masterpieces, the artist's signature means rejection, that no one can touch and add anything else on the masterpieces. So we can see very different attitude to the masterpieces in the Western and China. So I think the copyleft and a copy and appropriation is very good way to learn. Also, it's a way learn from the nature. Copy is copy, and copy can bring new things gradually and finally. It looks like, for example, we human beings will getting old. So the old one is very different from our young one. So of course, the older one is the bad copy of the young one, not so beautiful and not so dynamic. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I guess Marysia maybe want to comment on, like, do we still have master today, and to talk about also, like, do we actually talk about the ownership of copyright, or the ownership of copyright is something need to be kind of legitimized through a system? Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I thought it was interesting as to introduce the idea of copyleft, but not really speak about the origin of this term. And so I wanted to offer, I'm sure a lot of you here in this room have already encountered this in your work or in practices of other people. But I wanted to frame my contribution as an artist and take, I guess, a wider view to think about culture and to think of what kind of culture we want to produce, reproduce, and distribute. So for me, the bigger question related to copyleft or appropriation, although these are not the same things, is really how to move from the culture of permission to the culture of acknowledgement. And that is the kind of more fundamental to me, and what are the ways that would be achievable. And one of those ways is to not to think about copyleft as some oppositional space to copyright. In fact, copyleft itself is a form of copyright. It is a particular form of licensing. And when I think of what that means for an artist, it means a certain way of empowering yourself and also other people who you might want to share your works with, whether it's the work of writing, whether these are artworks, whether these are discussions. It's really a question of how you are able to decide what happens to your work after you produced it. And also how to address the question of always thinking that you are never at the origin of the work you make, that there are always circumstances, cultural conditions, other people, that you're continually responding, and it is that response that then you share, which is really more of I would say it's a moral question, it's an ethical question, and it's a form of a social contract. You are really inserting, I would say it's a kind of reciprocity condition. But to come back to Copyleft, Copyleft originally was a very new way of existing copyright law to ensure that the work remains freely available. So there is also this difference between open and free. And these are not just empty words, these are ways of conceptualizing how you contribute and how you control your production. So it's back to this idea of giving oneself a permission to guard your creativity and not to guard it through simply through an enclosure. And of course, things get more complicated where you have to distinguish between material things and immaterial things. Material things, even though they're obviously produced in series, so one person can own the same, I guess, Nike shoes or the ones that are very similar. It is different, and in that difference is where people make money in a place like this, in an art fair. So it is through recognition of that difference that value can be extracted. So Copyleft, in that sense, helps you and offers you the right to freely distribute copies and modified version of the work, but with the stipulation that the same rights will be granted and preserved down the line. And I think that's a very, very important proviso, is that while you modify and while you acknowledge in that process what you modified, possibly how you modified, you also release that work to be freely modified further or to be interpreted further. So it is in that openness, I think you create a very different relationship both to work and to people who might not just encounter the work, but to use it in the ways that they find relevant. So in this, so I would think of it as a social and a moral contract. It's a form of licensing and maintaining copyright conditions, and it originates from software, but of course it's used across all creativity. And it's binding, so it's not lawlessness. It actually is based on a legal agreement, and that the author extends to others. So it's a willful act. It's not just something that you do. And it's the act of free will. Now, in software, the source code will contain the acknowledgement of the authors. And that's also a very important point, is that you can trace the author. And why is it important? why is it important to, well, why is authorship still important? In my mind, as an artist, it's important because that way you declare that you take responsibility. And I think that's something that shouldn't be overlooked, is that the moment you attach your name to something, it is that moment where you share something with the public, but you also take responsibility for the statement. So this extension of rights, which Copyleft allows, I think it beautifully engages conditions of reciprocity. It actually encourages you to think of others. And there's the other aspect of it is the viral nature of licenses. And they often called viral due to their self-perpetuating terms. And it gives authors control and freedom to choose how to share. And I've been just doing a little bit of research on, because the next stage, I mean, Richard Stallman is at the, if you like, origin of the copyleft and software. But later on, Lawrence Lessig introduced Creative Commons licenses. And I was just looking at the Creative Commons China. And there has been a very impressive work done at the Renmin University. And now China has a 3.0 license, a Creative Commons license. So there's obviously an awareness, or a growing awareness, that it is important to think about freedom, and it's important to think of it in some legal framework.
I think it's very interesting for us to talk about this topic in art fair, where we're almost talking about to make like Creative Commons, so open source for art, so to free the art in an art fair where, of course, we need to put a price for the artwork and to make it circulate in the market.
Right, but I mean, apart from the physical objects that are bought and sold, there is the greater idea behind them. And I was just thinking during what you were saying, besides that, you know, in many ways the art should be free to evolve beyond one person has an idea, then one person takes it and runs with it. Whether as artists or as writers or in any creative endeavor, are we the, we are not so much the container of an idea as the conduit of it.
So I think it becomes almost a trend as well now in the art world, where more and more artists trying to practice kind of co-creative or co-creation, so that they are not the only one who generating or produce the art, but rather to invite other participants and do it together.
I think the good example of that is Paul Chan and his project Badlands, which is a publishing project. And he was speaking about this at the open platform, the AAA open platform. And it's really a way of co-producing, co-curating, and having a very clear idea how publishing is a way of creating the public.
Yeah, I was also thinking about the kind of copying as a kind of learning way, and how that still continues in the daily life. And I was also thinking about two examples. So one from Duan Jianyu, whose recent solo show in Vitamin Space in Guangzhou, where some of her paintings really look like Rodin style. So for an artist who's working in the market, it's kind of imitating again the masters in art history, but in the same time we have Dafen Village, where we have villagers who had no knowledge about like professional art production, but then they are producing Rodin every day and exporting even to foreign companies and to foreign channels and clutter. So it's a very interesting kind of parallel system now coexisting both the market and I don't know how to define Dafen village actually.
Well, we were saying earlier about how there is a certain culture of replication in education in China. So to learn characters, you just write them and write them and write them, thousands and thousands of times just to imprint them upon your brain. And, the education is very much centered around the Gaokao, and you just have to, there's a right answer and you have to get the right answer. But what's interesting is a good copy is just a copy. A bad copy is interesting.
Marysia was talking about because we are giving a context of China here, but maybe you want to give a little bit more information as well about this copyright or shanzhai thing is also existing or can be observed outside of China. And
I think I was trying to think about this idea of shanzhai not in relation to just fabrication. And maybe if you just stop on the level of manufacturing and thinking of art as a product of a kind of manufacturing process, that's only, I guess that's quite limiting. But one thing that occurred to me was to try and think of the shanzhai as a more radical practice in terms of not just intellectual property, but more proliferation of a certain moral code. Or, if we are going to think of precedents and examples, ideas that appeal to us, are they always residing in objects to be copied? Or are there certain ideologies, certain ways of behavior that would be quite useful to kind of recall, reframe, retrace? So more on this level of, on a conceptual level, and not just on the level of fabrication. So that would be of interest to see how much of that, how much of a really maybe also, if the Shenzhen is this kind of bandit, a village full of bandits, it's about counterculture. It's about raging something that is not agreeable with the forms and norms that are already established. So I would like to see a kind of more radicalized version of Shanghai, which is not just resulting in more copies of products, because then you really throw art into that mode, and that's not why, I guess, I wouldn't say that I'm involved in art for that reason of simply producing things.
Yeah, so it's actually not about real or fake. It's about an alternative for cultural and content production. Li Ping, do you want to? Yes.
I also want to say something positive about Shanzhai. For example, one day I found that my daughter watched the animation Tom and Jerry, but it's in Tianjin dialect. So I also watched with her, and then finally I found it's very interesting and very totally a new thing. The innovation, the image, nothing changed. Just added the Tianjin dialect, but the whole story totally different, and so we saw a very new story and very interesting and very funny. And my daughter always also imitating the way that Tom and Jerry saying. And also, I think in shanzhai or imitation is important way to learn. Even for the country or for the company under the development stage, like in the Western, in the end of 19th century, 19th century, the very famous film, The Watered Garden, there were totally more than 10 different editions. Because the story is very simple, but the film is very interesting. So a lot of audience buy the ticket to saw the film. So different companies to copy each other. So finally, there are more than 10 editions. So I think it's. In the Western, there are also things like shanzhai, not just Chinese, not just Chinese people do these things.
Yeah, but I think the Tom and Jerry thing is also about interpretation, like the recent Kung Fu Panda film. I think 1/4 of the lines are different in Chinese. So they made all the kind of funny stories interpreted into the Chinese context. I think we are about to open the floor to you. So if any of you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask or any comments, and then we can respond. Yes. Yeah, it's coming. It's on the way. Could you switch on the... Is it working?
It's okay.
Okay, now it's working.
Okay.
Thank you. When I saw the Copyleft show, which I thought was really super interesting, I was struck by the fact that you said in the Shanghai section that there was almost a kind of social justice aspect to it, in the sense that phones and certain kinds of products that are unaffordable, let's say in China, could be distributed within China. So I wonder if maybe Marysia's asking for a more radical model, whether that was already implicit in some of what you were doing in the show. And also I wonder what it means for an artist to do shanzhai. Can an artist really do it? Or is it like Dafen Village, where it's a different kind of definition of artists? I mean, you could argue that they're artists too, obviously, but it's not quite the kind of artist that would appear outside these walls.
Thank you. Yes, in shanzhai section, even some artists like Cai Guoqiang, one day he visited the PSA, and I also go to to see the exhibition one day, and I met him, and he asked, "Oh, whose exhibition is interesting?" The reason Cai Guoqiang like the exhibition Copyleft, because he also did something very similar. I think shanzhai for a lot of artists, just like I mentioned, something like Tom and Jerry in Tianjin dialect. Sometimes shanzhai brings very interesting new things. It's like copy or imitation in very humor ways. And also in my exhibition of Copyleft, I invited Han Feng. He also customized a series ink painting for the exhibition. It's like very similar, similar logos from like Coca-Cola. So in Chinese calligraphy, it's titled like not 百事可乐, yeah, 百事可乐. It's not a 百, it's like 白 just change a little, very few things. And also like Starbucks, it's also very similar.
Chinese characters, but they look like the real logo. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say in English, and yes, things like this. So I think all the artists also thinking about these kind of things. Sometimes just very similar copy or very similar imitation actually can bring something very innovation.
In some ways, you could say that all art is, in a way, shanzhai, because to shanzhai is to derive, and to derive is just to be inspired by something else or to get an idea from something else. So at the one end of the spectrum, sure, you've got the dafan and the straight-up copies, but the other end of the spectrum is any time an artist or anyone derives an idea from something else and builds upon it. The exhibition that you were mentioning by Cai Guoqiang was the Peasant Da Vinci's show that has traveled all over the world at this point. And what he did is he went out into the villages, and all these crazy guys, these farmers, had built, from scratch robots or submarines or UFOs, and all of these works themselves were very personal hobbies that these villagers had shanzhaied of these various vehicles. And so that's a very interesting example of how a shanzhai can be explored within art.
Marysia, do you want to add something?
Well, maybe we'll move on. Yeah.
Okay. I see a question here. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, it works. Lipping, you mentioned that in the past, a big master, Chinese master, they could get comments on the artwork. And so this is like an appropriation from the master of the artwork. And nowadays artists are making appropriation of whatever they want. And is there still is this still existing that the artworks produced nowadays give the possibility to the owners to make comments on the artwork, or is that over?
Actually, I'd like to answer and then move to you. Well, I think Creative Commons maybe is one way of thinking that it is building a way of responding. So it is building upon existing knowledge, and if we think of artworks not necessarily just as objects but as part of knowledge production, then that's really where it can happen. But there is also maybe, I was thinking about the master and the whole idea of the master, which is a 19th century idea, at least in relationship to art. And now it seems that in this whole discussion, the master is the market. It's really what people copy is not necessarily what they have a particular interest or emotional response to, is what they know will make them most money. And affect is often involved in that, but that will be the criterion by which to choose what to copy.
Thank you. Very interesting questions. Yeah, sometimes I also thinking about it. Actually, between the artists, I think, especially the ink painters, between them, sometimes they will, write comments on each other's painting. Sometimes now still, but if for the collectors, no, because we influenced by the Western ideas that do not touch the very treasures works. So normally there's no collectors do these kind of things to the artist's work, especially to the masterpieces of the old ages, and also.
Well, you can also see it in the way that a lot of artists are using digital technology by, say, posting a work in progress on WeChat and having a discussion, and then inviting people to, play around with something as it is developed. I guess that's kind of a continuation of what the ink masters used to do.
Yes, for the ancient Chinese people and for the painters, it's kind of also social ways to write comments and stamping, especially what I want to say is actually it's also a chance to show yourself, because if you want to write on the very treasure works, it means you're also good at calligraphy. But for nowadays people, it's very difficult.
I mean, I think there are some artists who are brave enough to say, shanzhai my work. It's something that's a work in progress, instead of being a perfectionist in the Western sense of this is done and it can't be changed, putting it out as something that is changeable and influenceable, and wanting people to actually shanzhai them.
Okay, maybe we can proceed to the question.
Yeah, I have a question for Marysia, actually. You mentioned how artist's signature or artist putting the name to a work implies a certain responsibility. And I guess this is actually, my question is kind of what the first question was a little bit like. What exactly, First, let me preface that a little bit by saying something, When you mentioned responsibility, it reminded me of how Foucault talked about authorship and the need for authorship, mainly as one way it came about was the need to punish, the need to find someone who transgressed, And I guess I want to put it more in a historically contingent, economically contingent form and sort of see the art system as it is. Because, when you have a lot of artworks, artists can just put something from the outside world, sign it, countersign it, and it turns into an artwork. If I, as a non-artist, put a urinal up, and it's just a urinal, but for an artist to put it in, it becomes an artwork. So I don't really see how appropriation works within this art system that we exist in, or what are the rules and how you as an artist personally would find it productive to work with this term. I don't know if this is a very convoluted...
I think the slight complication is that there are many artists that are in fact in this position where, yes, they do put their names to the work, but we don't know what they're doing. We really is only a very thin sliver of all artists working in different ways, and not just now, but also historically, that we know and that have been written about, that are put in context, that are discussed, and that have some effect on culture. So, and I think in the contemporary condition, it is not just a question of signing the work or having your name attached to it. Before that signature has any reverberation as a public voice, if you like, or part of a public discussion, that signature goes through a very complex system of manufacturing. And, you had probably some of you were here an hour ago when a British artist, very much a signature artist, was speaking here. And, everything that an artist does is not simply dependent on their decision. There's, as you obviously know, being a critic, the whole ecology or machinery of producing value so that then you can indeed extract value from that signature is a complex process. And, some artists never ever they never are engaged in that. They still make interesting contributions. And I suppose one of those artists that I have always had enormous respect for, and whose work was incredibly radical, was Michael Usher. Someone who really, I think, on all accounts, has sold 2 works in his entire life, and these were mainly works that were a kind of permission for a use of piece of land or something like that. So I think it's possible to contribute as an artist without turning your production into a revenue stream, and still taking responsibility for what you're contributing.
Hi. I'd like to ask Mariana for like your views in regards to softwares. Do you see like programmers as like sharing part of the authorship, or do you see the materiality of a software being merely a sort of limitation of that medium? Yeah, like for example, you voiced upon like how programmers will be like leaving trace in the codes of a work, and whereas like now we use Photoshop, like Premiere Pro, in almost quite a lot of like visual art culture like production, and some actually would think, well, if you think about oil painting, as in using oil, they give limitations. So the framework of softwares would be like giving a limitation as well. So it's software like kind of sharing authorship, the idea of like are they responsible for like the work produced? It's quite, yeah, I'd like to hear a bit about your view.
Well, I think software is a particular example, and it really relies on many contributions and on constant processing of different codes and decoding and recoding. And it's a very different culture of, I think, programming culture is configured quite differently, and also is, if you like, policed by those who are part of it. And they do want and need to be acknowledged. I think in the art community, which consists more than artists, and that I think happens in a slightly different way. And I think for me that key question of acknowledgement is what would really change the culture. I do not need to ask someone who has written something for permission to reuse it or reframe it, but I certainly would feel uncomfortable if I didn't acknowledge where it came from.
Yeah, I think it reminds me as well the big data thing now, how TV series and films are actually generated or produced based on big data, so what people want to see. So there's no longer a kind of script writer or filmmaker who generates or creates something, but rather the creation is based on the data, the informations. Do you want to say something more? No. Okay. More questions? Yeah. I'll pass you.
I have a question for all of the panel members, but especially for the lady on my left, whose name I don't know. Replacing the concept of monopolization or control with the concept of acknowledgement, that's all well and good. But what about derogatory treatment, what the French call moral rights? An example would be the Asphalt Jungle case in the realm of cinema, where the film was colorized and clearly John Huston would have turned in his grave if the essence of that film was to be a black and white film, the idea of making it color, or any kind of denigration, the Jeff Koons case, we see so much denigration of works. So once you're going to get rid of this concept or to minimize the concept of economic rights and strict control, how do you prevent, or do you prevent, derogatory treatment? Does the artist have, are there no limits on what can be appropriate or the manner of appropriation? Does the artist have no control whatsoever on how his work is treated?
Well, I mean, there are still copyright protections in place that if you object to the way your work has been appropriated, or if someone is passing themselves off as you can take legal action internationally. So those laws exist, and of course they are very hard to prosecute, but they're there for a reason. So I think it's up to the individual artist to say, like, what is an appropriate and what is an appropriate appropriation, so to speak. But within the laws, I think there's very much a boundary established of something that is, taking what is yours and putting someone else's name on it, or selling it as a very close facsimile versus something that's quite recognizably, we know it when we see it, something that's quite recognizably something new.
I never think, there are always limits, and in the end, I feel that everyone engaged in responding to or taking something from somewhere else has to impose those limits themselves. And I never feel comfortable with this idea of what I would say is policing of what is derogatory or why would this be wrong. Things that appear to be morally wrong in one culture might not be so morally wrong in another culture. There have been quite a lot of examples, especially with more political output of cartoons. And I think indeed politics and criticism, it's probably, these are very kind of strong ways of objecting to something and taking responsibility for that objection. So I don't know, maybe what you're thinking about is more, I don't know, is it really to do with hacking, to do with, a hack is really trying to, it's a kind of a territorial term. It's trying to take something and represent it or reuse it or reconnect it with different set of ideas. And I think it's no good to make some kind of a priori judgment, what would be permissible, where are the limits. I think artists are here to test the limits. That is what I feel is a function of an artist, is to test how far you can go with, but there has to be a purpose. And the purpose could be, very different to what I have in mind. But I still would like to see all the possibilities of contributing to a culture and questioning that culture. So for me, this culture of permission is the one thing that I will always question.
I forgot the name of photographer. He's a photographer of the small Marlboro. It's Richard Prince. Yes, the image is like the cowboy and
Richard Prince?
Richard Prince? No. If photographer for the Yeah, Marlborough. And one day he visited the PSA, and he told me his story about it's like I think it's Thomas Ruff, and he said one day one of his friends told him that, oh, you are participating artist of the Venice Biennale. He said, no, I never know this. Then he also visited the Venice Biennale and saw his photo of the cowboy in a big size showed in the Venice Biennale. Then finally he knows it's made by Thomas Ruff. And then also he discussed with the artist and also go to the lawyer. Then he's failed because the lawyer said that Thomas Ruff add something new and some new concepts for his work. So he's angry. Finally, he also painted oil painter after his own photograph. So, he thinks that he don't want to let someone else to copy him. So he copy himself in different way, use the oil painting.
Thank you, Li Ping, thank you, Marysia, and thank you, Lisa. Because of the time limit, we have to stop here. You are more than welcome to grab a copy of the art newspaper, English version, so you can continue reading about today's topic with Lisa's article, how China's tradition of copying is becoming a creative force. Thank you very much, and yeah, see you next time.